Your future life partner is pleading with you. Please read this message before it disappears. I dawn. Something changed the moment that message appeared on the screen, and whoever sent it knew you might only have a few seconds to see it. The words were simple, almost desperate. Please read this before it disappears. But there was something strange about the timing. No name. No explanation. Just a message waiting for you, as if someone had been holding those words back for far too long. And then came the line that made everything feel different. I've been trying to find the courage to tell you this. Who would send something like that? Why now? And why did it feel as though the person on the other side already knew you would understand? Picture the moment from their side. They're sitting somewhere quiet, phone in hand, staring at the message they've written and rewritten more times than they can count. Their thumb hovers over the screen. They delete one sentence. Type another. Stop. Breathe. Look away. Then finally, they send it. Not because they're completely ready, but because waiting has started to feel harder than telling the truth. And what they want you to know isn't about some dramatic secret designed to shock you. It's something much more personal. They've been thinking about the kind of life they want, the kind of relationship that feels peaceful instead of confusing, and somewhere along the way, their thoughts kept circling back to you. There's a reason they feel drawn to say this now, and the reason may be connected to a decision they've recently made. But there's one detail you haven't noticed yet. The message wasn't really about asking you to chase them. It was about asking you to pause long enough to recognize what they were trying to communicate. They've realized that a future together isn't built from perfect timing or grand promises. It begins with two people finally being honest about what they want. And that's why the next part of their message becomes surprisingly vulnerable. They admit that they've imagined ordinary moments with you, the conversations after a long day, laughing over something nobody else would understand, sitting beside each other without needing to fill every silence. They aren't describing a fantasy anymore. They're describing the kind of future they're beginning to believe could actually exist. And just when you think you understand why they reached out, the final sentence appears on the screen, and it reveals what they're most afraid you'll misunderstand. The final sentence didn't explain everything. It opened another door. Because beneath all those carefully chosen words was a confession they had almost decided not to send. I don't want you to think I stayed silent because I didn't care. That sentence changes the entire meaning of the message. Suddenly, the pauses make sense. The hesitation makes sense. Even the strange timing starts to make sense. They weren't trying to create distance. They were trying to understand their own feelings before placing them in your hands. And now, sitting there with the screen glowing in the quiet, they realize something uncomfortable but honest. Sometimes the person who cares the most can be the one who takes the longest to speak. They've watched opportunities pass. They've wondered whether you had already moved on emotionally. They've questioned whether saying too much would ruin something that still felt unfinished. But this time, they decided that silence was no longer protecting either of you. Then comes the part you probably wouldn't expect. They tell you that they don't need you to have every answer immediately. They don't expect some perfect response. What they want is much simpler. A chance to be heard without assumptions. They want you to know that when they imagined meeting the person they could genuinely build a life with, They stopped thinking about dramatic moments and started thinking about consistency. Someone who stays. Someone who communicates. Someone who can sit across from them after a difficult day and still choose understanding. And strangely, those qualities kept reminding them of you. Not because everything between you has been effortless, but because there is something about your connection that refuses to disappear completely. Even after distance, uncertainty, or time, the thought of you keeps returning. That realization frightened them at first. Now, it gives them courage. And if this message is speaking to something you've quietly felt yourself, take a moment and stay with it. You don't have to force meaning into every coincidence, but you can allow yourself to consider the possibility that some conversations arrive when both people are finally ready for them. There's another reason this message feels so urgent. They've reached a point where they no longer want to keep postponing an honest conversation. They've been asking themselves one question again and again: what if the person I've been waiting for has been closer than I realized? And now they're preparing to say something even more direct. Before we get there, if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, you can share the video with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe if you'd like to stay for the next part of this journey. Because the next words in that message aren't about the past at all. They're about what this person wants to do next, and that decision could change the way you see everything that came before. The screen went silent for a moment, but the person behind that message didn't. They were still there, staring at the conversation, wondering whether they had finally said too much. Then another message appeared. This one was shorter. More honest. I'm not asking you to believe everything right away. I just need you to know that I'm serious. Those words carried a different kind of weight. There was no dramatic promise attached to them. No attempt to pressure you. Just someone finally choosing clarity over hesitation. They explained that they had spent enough time imagining every possible reason things might not work, and somewhere along the way, they had forgotten to ask the most important question: what if they actually could? What if the future they were afraid to hope for was something they could build slowly, intentionally, and together? Then they revealed something they had never managed to say out loud. They had started noticing the little things that made them feel connected to you. A phrase you once used. A conversation that seemed ordinary at the time. A moment when you listened without trying to fix anything. Those memories stayed with them because they represented something they rarely found elsewhere: emotional ease. And that realization changed what future partner meant to them. It wasn't about finding someone perfect. It was about finding someone whose presence made honesty feel possible. Someone with whom they could talk about plans, fears, mistakes, dreams, and still feel respected afterward. They weren't suddenly claiming that everything was destined to happen exactly one way. They were admitting that they wanted to explore what might happen if both of you stopped allowing uncertainty to speak louder than your feelings. But then their message took an unexpected turn. They admitted there was one thing they were afraid you might do after reading it. Not reject them. Not misunderstand them. Something quieter. They were afraid you would read the message, feel something, and then convince yourself it was safer to ignore it. So they wrote one final thought: if you still feel something too, please don't disappear behind your silence. Read that again. They weren't asking for a perfect answer. They were asking for honesty. And suddenly, the entire message becomes less about someone trying to convince you of a future and more about two people standing at the edge of a conversation they may have avoided for too long. The next part is where they finally explain why they believe this moment matters, and the reason has almost nothing to do with what happened before. It has everything to do with what they're ready to change now. The message continued with a sentence they had been afraid to write. I'm ready to stop letting uncertainty make decisions for me. For the first time, you could almost picture the relief on their face after pressing send. They had finally named what had been holding them back. Not a lack of feeling. Not a lack of interest. Fear of getting the timing wrong. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear that by admitting how deeply they cared about the possibility of a future with you, they might change the connection forever. But now they understood something important. Avoiding the conversation was already changing it. Every day of silence created another assumption, another unanswered question, another imaginary version of what the other person might be thinking. They didn't want an imaginary future anymore. They wanted a real conversation. And then came a detail that made their message feel even more personal. They said they had started thinking beyond the excitement of simply meeting someone they cared about. They had been imagining what it would mean to actually build something healthy together. Morning routines. Shared plans. Supporting each other through stressful weeks. Celebrating small wins that nobody else would understand. Making decisions as a team instead of disappearing when things became complicated. That was when they realized why their feelings had become so serious. They weren't simply attracted to the idea of you. They were becoming interested in the life that could exist when two people consistently choose each other with patience and respect. And there was one quality they believed mattered more than anything else: communication. That's why this message had to be written instead of left unsent. If this story is reminding you of a conversation you've been waiting to have, feel free to share it with someone who appreciates meaningful reminders about love and timing. And if you want to follow where this message leads, you can subscribe and stay with the story. Because there is still one unanswered question. Why did they feel that this particular moment was the right time to finally speak? Their answer was surprisingly simple. Something had shifted inside them. They had stopped waiting for certainty before taking an honest step. They understood that no relationship can be guaranteed, and no future can be perfectly predicted. But they also understood that genuine connection deserves a chance to be explored instead of quietly abandoned. Then, just before ending the message, they typed something that made their hands pause above the screen. There's one thing I need you to know before you decide what this means. And what they revealed next was the part they had been carrying alone for much longer than you realized. Something about those final words made the room feel strangely quiet. You read them again, slowly. There's one thing I need you to know before you decide what this means. Then the typing indicator appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Whoever was on the other side was struggling with the next sentence. Finally, it arrived. I've been afraid that you stopped believing there could ever be a future for us. That confession changed the tone instantly. This wasn't about making some grand declaration anymore. It was about a fear they had carried quietly. The possibility that while they were gathering courage, you had already closed the door. They admitted they had noticed the distance, the unanswered questions, and the moments when neither of you knew what to say. And instead of blaming you, they realized they had contributed to the uncertainty by keeping too much inside. Then they explained why they couldn't let the message disappear without saying everything clearly. They had reached a point where they wanted their future to be built on honesty rather than guessing. If they cared about someone, they wanted that person to know. If they hoped for something meaningful, they wanted to have the courage to say it. And when they thought about the person they could imagine building that kind of life with, your presence kept returning to the picture. Not as some perfect character in an imaginary story, but as a real person with flaws, history, dreams, and a life of your own. That mattered to them. They weren't looking for perfection. They were looking for something genuine. Something that could survive an awkward conversation, a difficult week, or a moment when neither person had the perfect words. And suddenly, their earlier request to read this before it disappears made sense. They weren't afraid the message would vanish. They were afraid the opportunity to finally be honest would. Then came the sentence that made everything pause: if we ever become life partners, I don't want our story to begin with everything we were too afraid to say. That was the real heart of the message. They weren't asking you to promise forever from one conversation. They were asking whether you were willing to discover what could happen when both people stopped hiding behind uncertainty. And there was something almost peaceful about that realization. No pressure. No dramatic demand. Just an open door. But before the conversation could end, another message appeared, one they had apparently been holding back until the very last second. It began with 3 words, "I chose you," and then the typing indicator stopped. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the rest of the sentence finally appeared, and it revealed exactly what they meant. The sentence appeared slowly, almost as if each word had to overcome a little more hesitation than the one before it. "I chose you, to be honest with, even if I didn't know where this would lead." And suddenly, those 3 words carried a completely different meaning. They weren't claiming that every detail of the future had already been decided. They were choosing something much more important: the courage to stop pretending they didn't care. They admitted that for a long time, they had been waiting for some perfect sign, some perfect moment, some undeniable certainty that would make vulnerability feel safe. But eventually they realized that real relationships don't begin with guarantees. They begin when 2 people are willing to have the conversation they've been avoiding. And that was the conversation they wanted with you. Then they described what they actually hoped for. Not a flawless romance. Not a life where nothing ever goes wrong. They wanted the kind of partnership where both people could speak honestly without being afraid of judgment. They wanted to celebrate ordinary days, make plans that belonged to both of them, and have someone beside them when life became unexpectedly busy or complicated. They wanted to know what your dreams were, what made you laugh when nobody was watching, what kind of future you secretly imagined for yourself. And most importantly, they wanted you to have the freedom to say what you truly felt. If you wanted the same possibility, they would take a step forward. If you needed time, they would respect it. Because the message was never meant to corner you into an answer. It was meant to finally give you the truth they had been carrying. But then you notice something else. The final portion of the message is different from everything before it. The words are shorter. Softer. almost like someone speaking instead of typing. If you're reading this, please don't focus on everything that went wrong before. Look at what we could do differently now. That sentence changes the direction of the entire story. They weren't asking you to erase the past. They were asking whether the past had to control the future. And perhaps that is why this message arrived with such urgency. Not because something terrible was about to happen, but because an opportunity for honesty can disappear when people keep postponing it. They had finally decided to stop waiting for the perfect moment. And just when you think the message has reached its emotional ending, one final notification appears on the screen. This time, it isn't another explanation. It's a question, and the answer could determine whether this connection remains a possibility or finally becomes something real. Something about that final notification felt different from everything that came before it. There was no long paragraph this time. No carefully constructed explanation. Just one question sitting alone on the screen: would you be willing to talk to me about us without assuming how it has to end? For a few seconds, neither side moved. The question wasn't demanding a promise. It wasn't asking you to suddenly know the future. It was asking for something much more human. A conversation without fear deciding the outcome before either person had a chance to speak. And that's when the real meaning of the entire message became clear. Your future life partner wasn't pleading for a perfect answer. They were pleading for an honest opportunity. An opportunity to sit across from you, listen to what you actually feel, and finally stop letting silence write the story for both of you. Then another message arrived, and this one carried a quiet confidence that hadn't been there at the beginning. Whatever happens, I want you to know that I'm grateful I finally told you. Imagine the relief behind those words. The shoulders finally relaxing. The phone being lowered for the first time in what felt like hours. They had spent so much time worrying about how you might respond that they had forgotten something important: honesty itself can be a form of freedom. They weren't trying to control your decision. They were giving you information you deserved to have. And suddenly, the phrase, "before it disappears," takes on a deeper meaning. It wasn't really about a disappearing message. It was about a disappearing opportunity, the chance to say what mattered while the feeling was still alive, while the door was still open, while both people still had questions worth answering. And now, as you reach the heart of this message, there's one truth worth carrying with you: a future life partner isn't someone who arrives with a guaranteed script. It's someone who is willing to communicate, listen, grow, and choose the relationship through real life, not just through beautiful moments. That's why this message ends with hope instead of pressure. If there's still a part of you that wonders what we could become, don't ignore that question. Let's talk. And perhaps that is the most powerful part of everything they've said. Not a promise that everything will magically work out, but an invitation to discover what is possible when two people finally stop guessing and start speaking honestly. The screen goes quiet again. You have the message. You have the truth they were afraid to share. And now the decision is no longer hidden on their side. It's sitting quietly in your hands, waiting for what you choose to do next. Something unexpected happened after the message ended. Instead of sending another paragraph, they simply waited. No follow-up. No attempt to convince you. No flood of explanations. Just silence. And somehow, that silence said more than all the previous words. It meant they were finally giving you room to feel whatever you needed to feel. They had opened the door, stepped back, and left the decision with you. For the first time, the future wasn't being described as something guaranteed. It was being presented as something two people could choose to explore. And as you read the final words again, you realize that maybe the urgency was never about a disappearing screen. Maybe it was about a disappearing moment, the kind of moment that can pass quietly if neither person has the courage to acknowledge what is happening. Then you